You're watching a Decentered Media Talk with me, Rob Watson. Conversations about community media. Visit decentered.co.uk or follow on Instagram and Twitter at Decentered Media. Hello, Rob Watson here, and this is the 7th Decentered Media Talk as part of the series of talks, An Introduction to Community Media. And what I'm doing in these presentations, talks, is just highlighting some of the key issues that are associated with, or we can think of are associated with community media, which isn't the kind of straightforward corporate transactional kind of professionalized mainstream media, whatever phrase you want to use. It's media that's informed by community development principles, community engagement principles, empowerment, deliberation, all of those kind of issues which are relevant to a strong sense of social, civic and community life. So what I'm going to talk about in this session is some issues to do with the decline, or the sense of a decline of community. And again, these are starting points. We'll keep these conversations going. I'll keep adding to this. So this is, if you like, the first layer of paint or varnish that goes over this. And in the future, there'll be more presentations and conversations and discussions and pointers and reading lists and things like that. That will go into this in a bit more detail, a bit more depth. In time-honoured fashion, the notes will be available with the presentation as well. And at some point, I'm going to be producing a transcript of what it is I talk about. As ever with a kind of a talk like this, it's there are observations that are brought in which aren't necessarily pre-scripted or pre-noted. So that's a good part of the thinking process. And I hope that helps in terms of how we bring these ideas together, and any feedback that you've got, any discussion that we might engage in, that will be very useful to either produce additional content or to reproduce what we do in these conversations. So pardon me. So let's get underway. I'll share the screen. So the idea of this conversation, as I say, is to think about the way in which a kind of contemporary life is has contemporary life in, certainly here in the UK and many parts across the West, maybe more acutely in places like America, is characterized by a strong sense of decline of community. And there may be a nostalgic element to this, but all the metrics that are produced and the research that's undertaken indicates that people have a less clear idea of what community they belong to, how that community functions, and in what way that community could be used to further the support and develop the people who live and participate within that community. So our starting point is to go back to the definition, and we've talked about this in the last couple of conversations, to think about what community means, because it means lots of different things and could be used in different ways. So, is community a body of unified individuals? So if you like, a group, and maybe does that have to be formally recognized? Is it informal? Is it tacit? Is it something that kind of comes for a moment and then leaves? It's like it's temporary. But what brings those people together, I think, is kind of what drives what form of community that might be. So is it people with a common sense of interest around a particular topic, around a particular idea, around a particular social expression of an activity? Is it people living within a particular geographic area? And how do one of the challenges with modern life, and we'll explore this in this conversation, is the way that people interact with one another, and to what extent is that facilitated, and to what extent is that held back by the structures of the modern economy, modern transport systems, modern politics, modern civic engagement, modern administration and bureaucracy. All of these things play a role in the way that people interact and how people facilitate a sense of belonging and togetherness within that process. So that's kind of quite important to get right and to focus on. And then you can kind of further break it down into, is it people linked together by common characteristics, age, gender, ethnicity, social class, professional status, education status? Where is it that people, what kind of common characteristics is it that people share? And what links those people in terms of a common set of policies that kind of bring them together, albeit temporarily, in in an identifiable or recognized group. And we might, as individuals, and we might as groups, not wish to be part of that identification. If we think about policies during the pandemic that aimed at alleviating social isolation, a lot of older people said, actually, we don't think of ourselves as vulnerable and socially isolated, although, of course, there are older people who are vulnerable and socially isolated. But many people, did not want to be consigned in that policy criteria. So do we enter into these things voluntarily, or are they ascribed to us externally as part of the administration process? But also, what's the kind of history behind that? And I think, when people come together, or the embedded nature of a community is often because it's got a shared history which predates any kind of immediate grouping together, is that there's precedence to people's togetherness. Where they're located, there's a history. I mean, we'll talk about this in this conversation about the experience. The identity here in Leicester is modelled around and informed by very distinct routes into a common place, which actually describes a very different set of social experiences, a very different set of cultural expectations, those kinds of things. But also there's a link in through economic interest, in the sense that people have to work, have to engage economically, have to support themselves, you have to pay your rent, and you have to pay your bills. One phrase that is, it's fairly neutral on the surface, but actually can be quite charged, is residence. There's an implication and a connotation that comes with a phrase. If you use a community of residents, that doesn't necessarily mean that every resident has the same kind of rights, the same kind of responsibilities. What does that mean in terms of the broader economic interests? And that people often, many people now, the social housing model with private ownership and private landlords, people who rent in an area don't have the economic stability. They're quite insecure and they're not embedded within that community. And the social model, which would see economic returns maintained within the community, is not something that's so strong anymore. Maybe it's a model from the past that was more attuned to people's sense of belonging and identity. But now there's this idea of, if you like, extractive wealth rather than inclusive wealth. So this then leads us into a broader view in terms of political interest, maintaining the status quo, maintaining the power relationships that exist between social groups, who pays what tax, and how do people go about, who has the strongest voice within a community. But you can still, regardless of those differences, and they're, we shouldn't ignore them, and we should pay attention to them. There is still, overriding common interests, and these ebb and flow in the popular conversations about what is in our interest. And we've definitely seen this through the pandemic, that the maintenance of an individualized, privatized social model is no longer as what's the phrase I'd use? It's not guaranteed anymore. In fact, people maybe are thinking a bit more about collectivized, mutual forms of public support, because we've recognized that we can't live in isolation, and we have to have a certain amount of social support from one another in order to be able to weather the challenges of the future. So that ranges from personal interests and professional interests, and kind of around this and encapsulating this is the view of what this means for society at large. Historical, sociological views. There's the view about, if you like, our common characteristics, so we might call that a psychological view of a sense, where does our sense of belonging and recognition and identification come from within the community. And then there's the idea of a kind of joint sense of ownership around the notion that we are, it's a commonwealth, and if you're not part of that commonwealth and getting the shared benefits of that commonwealth, then why would you want to act in a socially minded manner, communitarian minded manner? And then are you able to participate in that? And regardless of people's intentions, not everybody has the capacity to participate at every level of community life. Some people will be passive within that the repertoire of community activities and expectations, most of the time through no fault of their own. But some people might be more active, so and some people might gain more benefits, and some people might not have as much benefit from their participation. And which voices are heard, which voices, and it's always a question we should always ask the question: whose voices are not in the room, whose voices are not being heard and expressed in the context of whatever it is that we're operating and running. So there's a lot of discussion going, kind of it's almost an obsession, if you like, that we are obsessed with our sense of identity in modern Britain, because we're not entirely sure what it means in practice. And I think the debates around Brexit are in the longer term are an example of this. What's our place in the world? How do we represent ourselves? Is that based on a deluded sense of self-chauvinism, a sense of kind of self-regard, which isn't true? Is it viewed on a sense that we regard other people, other countries, other people from other nations suspiciously? And then how do we bring that together? Is the integrated multicultural model the right way of going about focusing on a cohesive society, or are there other models of integration that we need to think about, and how do we need to make this work? Is patriotism an important part of it? What do you do if you are a recent arrival to the UK, in terms of how do you identify with the common values that are expressed in the UK? How do you move them forward, I think, is a good question. So this notion of what defines community is very charged with different aspects which can be controversial. They can be made to be controversial. They can be, to use that dreadful phrase, weaponized in order to suit certain political objectives. But it comes down to, I think, a sense of, I think it really is like a sense of belonging, that at some point we've got to have a sense of solidarity in order to be able to avoid the catastrophe and chaos of everybody just pursuing their own interests and no common regard for other people. And so, the pressure that antisocial behavior brings in a community can make life very disruptive and dangerous for people, because it breeds resentment and it breeds antagonism. And how much of our politics is focused on this idea of a model of social cohesion or social integration, where we are respectful of one another and we do offer mutual support, but we're also facilitated in that by the state and by public authorities and public bodies, and by civic and social mutual aid groups, charities, that kind of thing. And how is this discussed and played out in our media? What is the model of the good society? How does that interplay with our sense of ourselves? At the moment, the debate is about the breakup of the United Kingdom and the Scottish referendum, because the Scots feel that they can't identify enough with the English to maintain the United Kingdom, and so there's a breakdown of community in that role. But also sometimes challenges come about because of misinformation and misunderstandings of who and what achieves the goals that we want to see bear fruit. And so what I wouldn't want to do is suggest that, and I get frustrated with the kind of marketing-led approach that just identifies community cohesion, social integration, mutual aid and support as a kind of marketing tool, that everything's wonderful, everything's a rainbow and we just need to stand and come together. No, there are differences and there are things that we can't bring together, that are incompatible, and that's how society works. We have different points of view, we have different informing principles, we have different recognition of our identity, and to say that we can bring it all together in some kind of place or behind a model of social representation is kind of just paper thin. It's the surface, and we need to think very carefully about that. But again, something that we could talk about as we proceed with further conversations. So one of the informing principles about this is social capital, and where social capital fits, and who has social capital and who doesn't, or who has access to social capital, who has more social capital. So social capital is a kind of term which is used to indicate, it's like a metaphor that the way that money and resources circulate within the financial economy is similar to the way that social prestige and the capacity to get things done and the capacity to build resources, symbolic and actual resources within a community, is maintained, and you can think about social capital as something which is, it's taken for granted in many ways, because it's embedded in the social norms of a functional community, who knows who gets things done, who has contact with those people who make decisions, who has the skill and the capability to represent the community when an issue arises, like a planning issue for housing, that kind of thing. A community with high levels of social capital is easy to mobilize and organize. It's stable. It's got structures within it that enable it to talk to itself and to talk to other organizations outside of itself, whereas a dysfunctional community, for whatever reason, doesn't have that capacity. So it's kind of, what do we commune around is a really good example. We commune around physical infrastructure, libraries, schools, churches, places of faith-based worship resources, shops, those tangible things within a community, but we also commune around an idea of a sense of identity. And within that community, there are networks which are facilitate the exchange of social capital, ideas, information, knowledge. It's a mutual way of developing the resources that a community needs to sustain itself. But there are boundaries, and there are boundaries both of what in different types of different individuals and different groups can do within those networks. Some people have more social capital. Children, for example, do not have very little social capital because they're controlled by their parents, if you like, and their schools. They're not in a position to make decisions and choices where they can act freely in the community. And then other people have an incredible amounts of social capital because they've established a professional status within their community. And I suppose the argument is really is to what extent should we expect that to be, those patterns to be normalized, and to what extent do we want to look at and find out where those patterns exist and look at how we can change them to improve and facilitate the sense of community in a particular place. And I suppose what the point is of this is that we have to use our media within this. Our media is not separate from this process. Our media needs to be integrated into this process of developing a model of social capital, because we've seen in recent years, and it's kind of coming to the fore, particularly at the moment politically around the world, the way that the social media tech giants have monopolized a sense of ownership over and control over the networks that facilitate now facilitate an online sense of community, and how that soaking up of all of the resources and that grabbing everybody's attention unfettered by any restraints from local or national or transnational governments has meant that resources have shifted. Advertising in local newspapers, for example, has been seriously impacted on by the online shift to online news, because the news organizations are not getting paid for the content that is shared in social media platforms. And there's some movement and change to facilitate different models of how this can be addressed and counterbalanced. There's some move towards looking at how the essential news that a community relies upon is reconfigured, so that do you put in Facebook pays for community reporters now, and there's a raft of local news organizations that are benefiting from a relationship with Facebook, who are paying for additional content producers, reporters to work in areas around the country. But the question is it too little too late? Things like the algorithms that inform the social media platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, those kind of things, they're not decided locally, and we have no we have no capacity to change them. The decisions are made in a bunker in California. You can't walk down to your local high street Facebook shop or YouTube shop and say, I don't like the way that your algorithm is putting forward videos from my community, because there's nobody that you can talk to. It's separate from us. And the principle of no taxation without representation, is fits with this, because we are giving an economic resource to these giants. Yes, we get something in return from it, but we're giving them something which we have no input and control over, and we can't decide for ourselves. To some extent, with the BBC, we can intervene politically through lobbying our MPs and making representations. But that's a kind of top-down process where the BBC decides what's good for us, and we're not coming together as citizens to decide what's good for ourselves. And that's where I think community media comes in, is that we need to be empowered to reverse that process. So this is a very contentious set of debates and discussions. There's lots discussed and written about. If you want to look at some more information about this, look for organisations like the Media Reform Coalition and Better Media, where there's some focus on developing a more socially inclusive, bottom-up form of representation of media. So just to kind of think about what community, our definitions of community are grounded in, and it's always good to revisit these definitions and make sure that we're not, periodically from time to time, that we're not drifting away from what is a functional and practical and pragmatic sense of what community is, because we can be drawn into abstract thinking and kind of musings, philosophical musings, which don't bear any relation to the practice of living in neighborhoods and communities, places around the country. And we've seen this in the debate and discussion about the left behind places, as it's called politically. And there's the levelling up agenda from the present Conservative government is driven by a sense that there are parts of the country who have not benefited economically or don't perceive themselves as having benefited economically, and that they wish to be drawn into the economic wider exchange and see some material benefit in their communities. But part of that, I think, is down to a lack of self-representation and a lack of independence and a lack of ability to actually create and share their own content and to represent themselves, because the market isn't functioning correctly and the bureaucratic structures of the BBC aren't functioning correctly, but there's no investment in civic media and community media that counterbalances that. So it's really important that we have the right description of the process of what community is. And I found this quote is one of those quotes that you find on online, which is by W. Edwards Deming. If you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. And we can think about community in terms of facts and characteristics, if you like, but we also need to think about community in terms of a set of processes. So we look at community in terms of it's often vague, often it's variable, often it's contested. There's no straightforward way of thinking about what community is, but there is things, where do we sit within the spectrum of care, maintaining relationships, policing those relationships and thinking about the boundaries? What do we do for people who transgress the boundaries that we set out for positive social engagement? If somebody's antisocial, how do we deal with that? And then if there's a structural problem as to the nature of a community's through change, through shifting away of resources, benefit in other places, through policy and planning shifts and changes. We've seen the rise of in the last 50 years, 70 years really, since World War II, was how much more important the Southeast became, and that was accelerated through the 1980s, and the deindustrialisation process, which affected the north of England and Wales, parts of Scotland. These kind of, how do you maintain a balance of where you need to regenerate? So these are all kind of live issues, and it's really useful and helpful and essential to get the definition of community right that works in each of these contexts. One of kind of model that's worth looking at is the repeated reports about the loss of a sense of community spirit, and the idea that the contemporary kind of uh, urban environments, particularly cities I'm thinking of here, but there is a knock-on effect with rural communities at the other side, is that the kind of social glue that once was said to hold us together, which many people feel nostalgic for, and they have a strong sense of, one of the things that was expressed through the Brexit discussions, debates, arguments, was a sense that if only we could go back to being a society that worked together. And maybe it's a nostalgic view, and maybe it's a naive view, and maybe it doesn't take into account what's in front of us and what resources we've got today. But it does indicate that there's a shift away from the institutions that used to provide support for communities, such as the church. The number of churches that are closing, even pubs, the number of pubs have radically transformed in the last 30, 40 years. They're no longer local neighborhood pubs. People's expectations about, holidays, people don't go in en masse to Skegness and Prestatyn for Butlins holidays anymore. People fly to Spain or wherever, and it's so that the experience that people have of what a sense of community is has changed radically, and it will change again radically, and it will keep changing. I think that's the idea of, as we identify it as a process, then we're able to think a little bit more about how and why it might change in the future. But one way of thinking about it is to think about it as either a thin or a thick community. So in a thin community, there's a high degree of diversity, but a low degree of social solidarity. And in a thick community, there's one with a high degree of social solidarity, but a low degree of diversity. And I mean, that's just, a statement of fact. And to what extent do we embed that structurally within our planning system, our housing system, isn't widely discussed in the UK. The housing market has a tendency, if you like, to embed people in thick communities. They become immovable. So one of the challenges with the demographics of Leicester, and we'll look at this in a second, is you only have to step over the city to the county boundary, if you like, and the level of ethnic diversity drops dramatically. That didn't happen by accident. That was facilitated through social economic models of economic development through housing and planning applications and civic support. Why do we get these hotspots of areas with super concentration of diversity, such as Leicester or Birmingham, and yet other areas, the counties largely, and there's a real divide between urban Britain and county Britain. And we've got to look at these kind of demographics to try and make sense of it. And this is what the political parties seek to address, and when they're developing their strategies, and who are the winners and who are the losers, and how is tax and distribution of public funds identified within that framework. And it is part of the process of running and maintaining a well-ordered society. But we live in a world where we are faced with a rapid breakdown, ongoing breakdown of a sense of community, whether that's through how we communicate and we use electronic devices in order to maintain relationships and to keep in contact with people of a similar social characteristic as ourselves, or a sense of social identity as ourselves, but also with things like transport and the way that when I was a child, there was one or two people had cars on the street. This is the early 1970s. One or two people had cars. Now the average street has is lined with cars, and children are excluded from playing in the streets and playing in the in the road where we used to be able to play football for hours and there'd be an occasional car pass through. And so, and the not to mention the detrimental effects that congestion and pollution brings. And there's recent reports that links high areas of vehicle pollution with social deprivation, and particularly the association with people who live in urban areas of high social deprivation tend to be people from ethnic minority backgrounds. So it's a real issue. It has a real impact, and our nostalgia for how it used to be isn't really going to provide a solution, but neither is technology is not going to provide a solution either. And we have to think about ways in which we can engage people, to have people talking about their social experiences and their neighborhood experiences, those things which are completely overlooked by mainstream media and don't get brought into the conversation at any point. But they're the things that make a difference and impact on people's sense of the rapidity of change. Plus, there is a philosophical idea about, and again, this could be explored in much more detail, but about the how do we see ourselves as parts of a pro-social group or as individuals, and your individual freedoms are born out of your social embeddedness. I like the phrase that Robert Keegan uses, which is that we are embedduals. So while we are individuals and we have an individual characteristic, we cannot express or locate that individuality externally from the social and the community remit location that we're based in. And if we think about John Donne, no man, no person is an island entire of itself. We're part of a continent. We're part of the main, and we will be judged by how effectively we can build social alliances, and rather than perhaps individuals acting entirely alone and in isolation. And the aggregate of those actions is the economic model, which is kind of stuttering maybe at the moment, and certainly enough people argue against it. So we talked in the previous discussion about the work of Robert Putnam with Bowling Alone, and how the decline of American pro-social institutions, such as people being in bowling leagues or other social activities, has declined since the 1950s. So we've seen it with the rise of television. I was drawn to this isn't a nostalgia trip, I hope, but one of the people I've kind of reconnected with is a photographer in Liverpool called Rob Bremner, who's available on Instagram and has a website and stuff, and the link will be in the notes. But he's re-exhibiting pictures he'd taken in the 1980s and 1990s from around Liverpool. And it's a reminder to me of, yes, this is the world I was kind of growing up in. I was a teenager at this point, and it was a fairly tough and thankless place in many ways, and the whole culture of a city which was in industrial decline became quite fractious and was embedded in a kind of a reaction which saw its sense of identity becoming quite violent, and there were, it was played out through football as well, with things like with Hillsborough, and then with the I can't remember where it was, the European Cup where the wall collapsed, and there was the associated violence that went with it, and it's taken a lot to regenerate and revitalize the city. And if when I visit Liverpool now to go and visit family, it's a different place. still has that roots in its sense of identity, but some of the economic and social transformation that has taken place, particularly around the centre, because that's where, unfortunately, the UK economic model has been focused on urban centres like this, like Manchester, Leeds, Cardiff. It's transformed, but sometimes it's not until we look back 40 years previously that we see the distinctions and we see what we had. And to be honest with you, I couldn't wait to get away, and that was one of the things. I didn't have that sense of belonging, sense of identification with a place. I moved away, and many other people did as well. And it's how does the community can't be a straitjacket. You can't. It's not a prison. You have to. People have to want to be part of a community. So a couple of videos just to consider for a moment.
This is Leicester, known before the Romans came, more prosperous today than ever before. For the city today is one of Britain's most important industrial centres. The old gatehouse makes a comparison with the new fire station no more extreme than the difference in many of the industries, which ranged from stockings to steel parts. The War Memorial honours the city's fighting men who died in World War I. The Abbey ruins pay tribute to the city's glory in the past and to Cardinal Wolsey, who is buried here. But the real benefactors of the city are remembered on the clock tower at Leicester's centre, particularly Simon de Montfort, one of the city's greatest men. Named after him, the de Montfort Hall is one of the finest concert halls in England, and people flock here from all over the Midlands. They come to shop or work, for this is a centre of vitality. In Leicester they work as they play, hard, but they're very much alive.
So I thought I'd put another video in with this, so bear with me while I access. Now I might have to stop the share for a second, access another video, which I hope will come up in a second, which would give a different experience from that. Oh, hang on, let's go. Right, I'll just share the screen again. We'll go back to this in a second.
Imagine it now. You've got a life, you're settled, you're happy, you're comfortable. Then to be told that actually you've got 90 days to get out must be so hard. Must be so difficult to just up and leave everything that you've built behind and go to a different country that you may or may not know. In 1972, Idi Amin gave the Asians 90 days to leave the country. And so people left with 90 days. They left with nothing.
Friday, I announced the decision of my government to ask the British government to take over responsibility for the British citizens of Asian origin living in Uganda who were sabotaging the economy of this country.
The story, again, from my understanding, is that Leicester City Council took out an advert in the Ugandan newspaper, the Uganda Argus, and asked them not to come, asked the Asians not to come to Leicester because they couldn't cope. They didn't have the infrastructure. So of course everybody had heard of Leicester, and it almost backfired on the city. And over 4,000, I believe, actually came here. So one of the largest groups of Asians arrived here in Leicester because they'd heard of it. I was only 2 when we came to this country, so I was a baby. I don't remember any of it, unfortunately, but all the things I've learned from talking to various different people, including my own family, is the knowledge that I have. I think a lot of people know the basic story, the basic history of what happened in Uganda and how the Asians were kicked out. Those really personal stories, I think, that will have the most impact.
So just to the link is on the network, but what I wanted to do was contrast the two time periods. So if we think about Leicester today, that Pathé News sense of heritage and integrated identity that existed in the 1950s is not the same story that a large proportion of the population of Leicester experienced, and one of the catalysts for change and the multicultural nature of Leicester is down to the immigration into the city and the reasons for that. And Rupal's project Uganda 50 is a really good example of how to, that time period, 50 years, to reflect on the changes that have taken place and look at people's stories. And I think that kind of ethos of developing a community narrative based around the processes of that drive change, and sometimes that's forced and isn't voluntary. Sometimes it's met with open acceptance and welcoming, and sometimes it's people are pushed out and not. There isn't an open welcome for people on that basis. And so that kind of the model of change that we need to adapt to and think about has structural, economic, political, historical precedents that inform the nature of change and the way in which we have become who we are today, and how that works in practice. Another significant factor that affects areas in the UK, particularly vastly differently, is the kind of social breakdown and access to wealth, and how predominantly the wealth that is maintained around the UK is held in the county towns, and that the hotspots for poverty are associated with inner urban areas of cities and towns and former industrial areas, and the kind of overlay of who has access to an average income or above average income or above average resources and wealth, whether that's tied up in property or whether that's through business investment, is quite starkly. Some areas are clearly more deeply affected by poverty and structural decline than others, and this is an ongoing political discussion, quite rightly. Who is responsible for this? Well, when we were members of the European Union, there was the European structural funds, and the European Union took on board a lot of responsibility for managing the redistribution and regeneration process. We're not quite clear as we speak at the moment as to what the UK government has in place to replace that, or whether it's going to fund it to the same level, or whether it's just going to use a free market model, which seems to be the preference of this present government to achieve regeneration objectives. And there's a good argument for on either side that the state shouldn't decide how people earn their living, but the free market is clearly failed in many ways in many places, and doesn't offer the same kind of opportunities to people as we might wish, and be pragmatic and not and don't look for magical thinking is one of the concerns about that. But it's another factor that we really do we just have to look at, and the understanding of what the root causes of poverty are is that don't go blaming people. I mean, my experience from grown up in Liverpool is that there were a lot of problems with an over sense of self identification and grievance in Liverpool in the 1970s and 80s, but it wasn't through the fault of wanting to improve. And the danger is that what you become moralistic about it, and public policy decided on moralistic terms that people are feckless or worthless is bad public policy. And it also indicates how the narrative about that is becomes self-reinforcing, because we don't have access to independent media, we don't have access to independent news. Not everybody can afford to pay for subscriptions for newspapers and news services, for example. So when we're thinking about community and what defines a viable community is partly the level of, as well as economic resources, it's the level of connectivity within a location, a place. And what brings about economic development? I don't know. I mean, which way does this work? If you consider the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which identifies a self-actualization at the top of the pyramid, and the basic building of human resources, we need food, we need shelter, those kind of things, which leads to a process of I'm not necessarily sure that that's actually what Maslow actually argued, and I need to double check that, but switch it around the other way, invert the pyramid, because you need human capacity in order to bring about economic development. You can't put economic development in place without the human capacity, and that means investment in education, culture, civic deliberation, conversations, and how the social world is then organized around people, rather than, if you like, around. I mean, the interesting example is about the regeneration of Barcelona away from cars, and we see this in places like Copenhagen and other. Paris is going through this process at the moment of pulling away from being a car-based economy. The cars have still got free access to most of the city along prescribed routes, but there are buses, there are trams, there are cycle lanes being put in place, and it aids economic regeneration. And cities around the UK are going through this process now. We're going through this process in Leicester, and people's expectations about what you can do. Your right to drive your car anywhere, almost up to the door of any business. I always use the analogy I use as the tram in the town. I do like trams. I do like going to places with trams, because they're a great way to get about, and they're like clockwork. They get you from A to B, and they get large numbers of people from A to B from, 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning until midnight. And you can pretty much guarantee they're a very stable form of transport and connection. Large numbers of people, but also socially democratic, because a well-maintained and well-designed tram service is used by rich and poor alike, old and young alike. They're very accessible. You don't have to struggle like you do when you struggle to get on a bus. But what happens when people want to go into the clockwork like nature of the tram? Nobody talks to each other when you're on the tram. People are reading books, checking their phones, looking out the window, listening to music, whatever it is they're doing. They're not interacting with each other. People go to the destination, which is the town, where they then sit in bars and cafes and go shopping and go to art galleries and things like that. So the vehicle, the system that enables people is one side of the process. The social interaction is the aim, and to validate that social interaction, and a pro-social model. And the nature of our towns and cities is changing, because towns and cities, Leicester, for example, because this is where I'm based, was an industrial town, It wasn't a place of recreation. You didn't go into town to relax and meet friends. That just was, it's like the town didn't function in that way. There were shops, there were businesses, there were warehouses, there were engineering workshops. There was all sorts of other activities there. It wasn't a place of recreation, which we view it as now. And that change, what are the urban environment implications for the sustainability model? Are they going to change and shift again? And that notion of community that is built around that is an essential part of how we define ourselves, because it's always going to change. And that sense of, as we kind of indicated earlier about shared identity, is really, really crucial, I think. And Robert Putnam, writing in, I think it was about 2007, caused some consternation, because he talked about the idea that the identity model, the integration model, can actually be counterproductive. And that a model of integration which doesn't recognize differences is not a functional model. So, for example, if you think about people's faith, if you can't have, by definition, an open-ended model of faith. Yes, you can bring people together to do interfaith activities, but then you can't say, well, somebody can choose one person of one faith cannot choose to and expect to be accommodated by people of another faith in the practice of that faith. So if you want to go to if you practice one particular faith and you want to go to somebody else's temple, synagogue, church, if you want to go to somebody else's, you just can't be expected to be accommodated. You have to fit in with that. So that suggests to us that the integration model isn't this open process of anybody can do what anybody wants to do. It doesn't work like that in practice. But we still have to find a way of mutually respecting each other's differences and making sure that we recognize a set of community values which incorporate those differences, but at the same time transcends those differences well. So it's how we work this through and what the focus should be within our media. It's naive to think, this is why I don't like the marketing model approach, where you just get a wash of different types of people all supposedly having the same kind of social cultural experience and all motivated by the same virtues. It's naive to think about that, and we need to unpick that and look at that and think about how it works and consider what's going on, because otherwise we won't get a functional sense of community. It would just become something which is kind of facile and what's the word I'm looking for? It would just be worthless. So how do we, is a community a place where we all conform to the group's expectations, or are we enabled and empowered to express our individual identity and conscience? And to what extent is that coordinated and facilitated, and to what extent is that kind of ignored? And I think the great thing that I'm drawn to about community media is that, okay, we don't know the answers to that, but at least we've got a platform through which we can have the conversations, and that we can open this up to a discussion rather than it being something which we, if you like, just lock down and deny those differences. The idea of celebrating people's differences is not just about painting a rainbow. It's about actually understanding and reaching the point where you've got those real differences, where you know what those differences are. And how do you get to the point of mutual engagement when people are at that final destination point when they will not budge from their view and what they hold as being valuable? That's when you really begin to understand how an integrated community can work. But if you listen to our mainstream corporate media, there's very little sense that kind of consideration needs to be given to our sense of belonging, our sense of identity, our sense of location, and what informs that. And some things we can trade and swap, and some things we'll say no. This is purely a recognition of absolutely of who I am and what I do, and I won't compromise on that. And that social discussion is kind of being bypassed as well. And this is kind of what happens is it compartmentalizes a sense of community, and it drives people into sticking in their echo chambers, where you have a self-reinforcing view of yourself and your colleagues and your neighbours, which becomes informed by its own assertion of its own rightness, rather than it being tested through interaction with others. And a pro-social model is one in which that interaction, that testing through interaction, is something which leads to a more positive outcome rather than a negative outcome. So that kind of loss of community spirit is sometimes down to a lack of capacity to engage and identify what our community spirit might be for the future. And as we've changed, as we've shifted as an economy, as a society, and as technological change continues to inform and direct our social experience, our public experience, then we need to rethink how we do. It's no good harking on about the industrial clout that the UK used to have. That's moved elsewhere. What are the new things that we can invest in that are part of our common identity? We talk about shipbuilding, we talk about the steel industry, we talk about manufacturing, but we haven't invested in those things as an economy for 60 years. And indeed, we biosciences, information and computing sciences, they're areas that are design sciences, they're areas that we are strong in, but they have less of a sense of common identity for if you like ordinary people. They're more specialist. They're small. They employ small numbers of people and create high return. But it doesn't mean to say that there's a biotech company is not going to support a working men's club or a women's institute group, and maybe they should, but it doesn't seem to me as something which they would be readily attuned to becoming an integral part of their local communities. That's not how these kind of tech sciences, information-based, knowledge-based economy works. The knowledge-based economy, the one that we've seen rise up over the last 30 years, is not rooted in communities. And to some extent, the argument that the knowledge economy produces citizens of nowhere is a valid point. So social capital then becomes is incredibly important because it's what enhances our engagement and productivity, and you can think of this in practical terms, but you can also think of this, if you like, in more symbolic terms. And it, because what social capital does, it both gives you the practical resources, but it also shows you the scope of what is possible. And that's an imaginative process. And if you live in a community where you don't recognize what the opportunities might be, and to use that awful phrase that's knocked around in politics, you don't have the aspirations to engage in a broader sense of, if you think that there's no point in me getting educated because people like me don't do well in middle-class jobs, if you like, because you're from a working class background, then that's a symbolic issue as much as it is a practical resource-based issue. The two are connected, and it's about those kind of social networks, the level of education, the form and type of education that you have, the reciprocity and the nature of trust within a society, that you trust people to act honourably and in the mutual interest, and not to rip each other off, and not to just extract and to get what they can. but also a sense of, you take responsibility for your productivity, so that, we add something to the economic process, but it's tied with a sense of civic virtue as well, which is, and again, this is one of the things that's disconnected with things like chain stores, and the economic model I kind of veer towards is distributionism, which is that which can be done at the lowest level should be done at the lowest level, and break up the chain businesses and the franchise-based businesses, because it should be businesses that are run independently and individually by entrepreneurs who are acting in the interests of themselves, their families, and their community locally, rather than just being part of a corporate structure that is, you're more interested. For example, you could run a coffee shop, and as a manager of a coffee shop, you're only interested in where you are in the internal corporate structure, rather than what's happening in the street outside and what resources the local community has to be part of that society, to form a society. And I think that, kind of one of the changes that we've seen in the last 50, the economic model that we've seen is moved away from being a pro-social model to being a corporate model, and it lacks innovation. Again, it's another conversation for another time, but the kind of social capital model is really important with this, because it's underpinned by the information, the learning that takes place within a community. And that learning isn't just about managing information, and unfortunately our education process seems to be quite reductive at the moment, where it thinks that learning is just about information management, and that's far from the fact. But it's how we exchange and develop and nurture ideas, emergent ideas that are capable of facing the future, and we have to do that in a community which is reciprocal, so that we can exchange ideas, we can have difficult conversations, we can posit new ways of doing things, and we can value the things that we already have established and that have been previously established. It's two sides of the same coin, is to say, kind of, we want something new, but we have to build that on what worked well from former generations that we've been bequeathed. And that requires, if you like, a kind of sense of common identity and collective action, where you have a set of issues that you prioritize and you agree. So at the moment, sustainability and achieving a low carbon economy are something that we need to really push out into the wider society, so that it achieves common consent, because there are many changes that are going to need to take place, and the danger is that you have to force that onto people rather than them consenting to it. And if you believe in a democratic society manages change through consent. What you don't want to be doing is sending police, battalions of police and paramilitary forces to force communities to change. That's, you can't do that. You've got to do it on the basis of the kind of broader sense of solidarity that a community can come together to meet challenges and changes. So my point is about this is, where are those conversations taking place? Well, that's what I think community media could do if it had more confidence in itself and more confidence was placed in it, because it's about community participation. It's about engaging people, and this is well established in the community development model. It's about how do we foster a network which is functional, socially functional, not just as a collection of contacts that we use for our personal advantage, but something where we actually do come out of the process of deliberation and discussion and conversation and listening to one another with a deeper rooted view that what we're doing is fit for purpose and right, and supports the wider majority of people who will be impacted and will have to pay for that in the future. So the decisions that we make now, how do we make sure that we have consent, not just with the existing generation, but with future generations, in order to ensure that we're doing the right thing? And I think the climate crisis is going to squeeze this, but we don't have the structural infrastructure, the social infrastructure to achieve that sense of consent and participation, because the media model that we've got at the moment is broken. It's not addressing issues of consent and engagement in the way that it should be. So development practice is the model that underpins the renewal and regeneration of a sense of community, because it looks at what's, first of all, who is participating in a situation, who is participating in a discussion, who is able to talk about and share their experiences, and then you've got to ask the question, well, what are they participating in? Is it just, kind of this, the interesting thing about social media, when you ask people who use Facebook, there's clearly a sense of a community that engages people in Facebook, but it's so disorganized that there's no sense of focus to it. And that's, kind of, it's many layers, and it's like many things going on at the same time. It's diffuse, it's decentralized, but do we need something which is still readily identifiable, that people can actually identify with? And that's why things do identification with where you belong is so important. It's so crucial, because without that we can't function, because we can't organize ourselves to focus on a particular objective. It just becomes too disruptive and disrupted. But within that, there's cultural expectations about values and what we regard as normal, and within that, and that again, it's fluid, but there are bedrock principles that I think we can achieve a consensus about, but also areas where we can push the ideas of what it means to be, what those values are and what those norms are. But also then thinking about what, kind of explains, what skills do people need, what motivation is it that people have, what knowledge do people share, and given the wide disparity of cultures that exist side by side in Leicester, places like Leicester, you've got a widely varying range of cultural expectations and symbolic expectations, and it would be naive to think that you've got a unified society with a unified purpose. There's to some extent that kind of comes together around things like identification of the city as a place of belonging, or the football as a kind of recognizable symbol of that belonging. But underneath that, it's how much does that function cohesively, and how much is that integrated and producing reproducible? How sustainable will that be in the future, or is it likely to kind of cause antagonism? And because it's just as likely that the social arrangements that we've put in place or allowed to evolve can be destructive, as much as they can be productive. And we always should be careful that there, but by the grace of God go we, because we could end up on the wrong side of this. And many times we're lucky in many ways that social cohesion in Leicester is stable, but it doesn't mean to say that it can't be destabilized. And we need to think about what those institutions are and those communication networks are that enhance that stability. So what are the structural resources that we may need to invest in? And then what are the implications? What does this bring us in terms of a benefit? What's the value that we gain from this? And what can we learn from other people, and what can other people learn from us? So we're opening this up, the idea of to address the crisis of a sense of community is to open this up as a development practice and say, look, this is a process that it's like we're going to redesign this process, but you need to see how it works, and you need to understand, and you need to be part of this to get a sense of how it works. And we don't know what we're going to come out with because it'll continually evolve, but we need to open the process, and we need to allow people to participate in that process, and our media has to be part of how that process functions and works at that level. At this point, Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation is always worth looking at, because it does highlight in what way citizens' power can be used or abused. So the kind of, the virtue of civic engagement and communities making decisions for themselves, and using resources and planning for resource use in the future, symbolic and actual financial and physical, means that you've got a high degree of control. But at the bottom end of that ladder is that you've got no power, and effectively what you've been doing, you're being manipulated, or worse, you're being treated in a kind of therapeutic way where you kind of condescended, that you're not quite able to make up your own decisions for yourself. So somebody will come along and make the decisions because they know better. And avoiding things like tokenism. And I think it would be useful for us at some point to go through these scales and to look at how our media, any community media group, organization, really might want to evaluate itself against something like this scale, and look at how this works in practice. Are we just being tokenistic about the kind of services that we provide, or are we giving people a real sense of ownership, responsibility, control over what it is that we produce? So that participation then adds another couple of elements, which is the social capital model, which says that, well, there's another, when you bring people together, what ties people together? Well, it's a sense of, there's two elements to this. There's the bonding element, and there's the bridging element. So one of the dangers of a strongly, we talked about thick and thin earlier, but one of the dangers of a strongly bonded community is that you don't get that interaction for networking with other communities. So if you think about it in terms of jobs, say, for example, you feel that you belong to a community that has a high value on a particular faith, and you tend to stick to people and with people of similar faith, maybe similar ethnic background, similar gender identity, that kind of thing, and you kind of don't go outside of that. Well, you've got a very limited opportunity there for employability and jobs and economic opportunities, and those economic jobs are facilitated by a high level of bridging capital, so that you're able and to facilitate to go around different networks and make contacts with people and work with people from other communities in a mutual interest of exchange. And the danger is that you can leave strongly bonded communities in isolation, but the other flip side of that is people who are high in bridging social capital don't belong anywhere, and that they don't have roots. And there's a balance to be achieved, which individuals have to think about, but there's also community groups have to think about, neighborhoods have to think about. If you can be a strongly bonded neighborhood, but you can be cut off from the rest because of poor transport links or poor communication links. You can be cut off from the rest of society, neither of which are good. So the idea is to kind of anchor points, if you like, in our social community lives, but at the same time having the facility to interact with one another and exchange. And I think that's, for me, community media is something which is about bringing people together to exchange and deliberate and share stories and ideas and experiences, rather than it just merely being something which you're only ever talking to the same kinds of people that you're comfortable talking with. And this is a criticism of myself as much as it's a criticism of anybody else. So it's the community engagement approach and again, we can kind of think about how we rate our community media activities on the basis of that range of to what enhances involvement and participation, information, consultation, collaboration, empowerment, What are the levels of those factors that kind of determine or shape what we think of as our sense of community? Because a community that can't collaborate might not be classified as a functional community, and it needs some investment in capacity building around collaboration. But that might call on a sense of empowerment, which means some people stepping back. So often what happens, those people who are well or capable of expressing their voice and their view and their opinion often always do, and those people who are less confident about that or less well positioned to do that kind of further hold back. And I suppose our objective is to kind of moderate that to some extent and say, no, we have to provide the space and the platforms for as many people as possible to come in and collaborate, and not just to kind of be tokenistically talked about, but be able to express their opinions and views directly within the process. So effective community participation is something that identifies the needs, the priorities, the capacity, and the barriers. And we put it into a context where we're able to listen to one another, empathize with one another, but also respond to that. And I think, kind of for me, the characteristics of radio is all about listening. And good radio is about empathy. And a lot of radio, as it's presented in the kind of corporate world, is not empathetic. It's personality led, it's entertainment, and it's not really about listening to people and engaging with people. There are different models of radio that are practiced in other places, which aren't so well practiced here in the UK. But having a model where we are actually engaged with each other and understanding and getting a sense of what our social experience and our story has been about, that's the point where we're then in a position where we can respond in different ways. So it's kind of the practices, the media practices have to be based around inclusion, and that means adopting a different mindset in terms of how you engage with people and what is an inclusive way of bringing people in who aren't confident or who are often overlooked or ignored or not included in public discussions, to feel confident that they can take part in a conversation as well. So this idea is that we look at the idea of what communicate, what participation is, and it's not a neutral process. It's shaped by the objectives that are set out by the people who are trying to encourage participation, if you like. So it's not a magic bullet, but nor is it something which is innocent. And participation has a purpose. As long as we're clear and transparent about what the purpose of that participation is and who benefits from that, then I think you can bring people along with the conversation. But if you're not clear about that, then people become distrustful and feel as if they're just being used as part of a process which they're not engaged in. And it boils down to, it's kind of, in a simple ways, it's really building relationships through telling our stories. It's really not about anything much more complicated than that. And sometimes we can get lost in, and I know I can get lost in the theoretical propositions and the ideas and where it interfits with things. And I can have conversations with people where it's, we can talk about this in a very abstract kind of way, but really what it boils down to is somebody feeling confident that they can tell you their story, and finding ways for that to fit in. But that takes a lot of time and effort for that to be built into the process of engagement, because it travels at the speed of trust. And if people don't trust our media generally, why would they trust our community media? We have to operate and demonstrate our trustability. Is that a phrase? It is now. We have to operate and develop a sense of purpose, which is people can experience, and therefore they feel more relaxed and confident that they're not being exploited, they're not being misrepresented, that they have a say in how and what the form of media is being used for and why it's being. So you're building a relationship. You're not extracting information. You're not doing something to people. You're empowering and inspiring people to do something for themselves. So it's this kind of sense of community. How do we build a community? We need those strong social relationships in order to move forward and to imagine the future and to cope with and facilitate those people who are going to come through, those younger generations who are going to come through, who are going to learn from the older generations, and the new arrivals with the established arrivals. The people who've there's so many ways that you can intercut this and move it around. We shouldn't worry about it being perfect, but we should get on with it. I think it's like if we're waiting for something to be perfectly understood and perfectly managed, then we're never going to learn from our experience in terms of actually implementing this, because our capital, our positive use of social capital can become a virtuous circle. This is our aim. Promoting a functional, inclusive model of social capital is something that we know will improve our social cohesion, whatever our resources are, whether it's urban, rural, central, suburban, whatever those situations are. The interplay of ideas and experiences and observations through our media is something that is going to vastly enhance how we move forward and how we get consent to manage the changes that we need to we need to put in place, particularly as we're dealing with climate crisis. And bear in mind that the International Panel on Climate Change called for systemic change at all levels of society, and this has to include our media. We can't do it without systemically changing our media as well. So the notes are going to be up with the recording. Should you want to have a conversation, we're up on the forum, forum.decentered.co.uk. But in the future presentations, we'll take some of these ideas forward. We'll look at them in more detail and kind of getting back into the process of mapping them out in my mind to know where we kind of need to fill the gaps in, and maybe bring some other people in to share their expertise about this as well. But that's all to come. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I will look forward to the next conversation. So speak to you soon. You've been watching a Decentered Media Talk with me, Rob Watson. To find out more, go to decentered.co.uk or follow on Twitter and Instagram @Decentered Media.